Thank you for this opportunity to talk at this meetup. And I'm very interested in people's thoughts and reactions. This talk is about Agile 2, which is an effort that started approximately last April, although really it kind of started a long time before that. We published our work in October. So let me get going. Sorry for talking on mute. I use Zoom a lot. I teach some DevOps courses and I use Zoom, and I find the Zoom controls are not that friendly. But anyway, I personally, a little bit about my background in Agile. I've been in the Agile community since 2000. In 2000, I was 5 years into a startup that I co-founded in 1995. And by that time, it had grown to almost 200 people. And Kent Beck's book, Extreme Programming Explained, had come out, and it was being passed around in my company. And one of the project managers brought it to me. I was the CTO. And he said, you have to read this. One of our architects, Jeff, says we should be doing this. And so we tried it. We tried extreme programming with one of our teams. We tried it for real, and it worked out really well. In hindsight, I think it worked out well because we had some really good people. That particular architect was really good. And I feel it really comes down to the people, not so much the methodology. But I'll talk about that. So I'm not an Agile doubter. I've been an Agile advocate since the early days, since the very beginning. But I've felt from the beginning that there were powerful ideas, but they weren't quite right. There were these edges that weren't quite right. And so I've paid close attention to the community and to kind of the thought space. And I've noticed that there are a lot of other people who feel things aren't quite right, and they tend to be in the developer community. I often do an experiment where I'll go into a group online of Agile coaches and say, what do you think of the state of Agile? And usually it's very positive. You know, it's great and it's getting better all the time. But if you go into a group of developers and say, what do you think of Agile? You get a much more mixed response. Some of them think it's great. Some of them think it's terrible. And the lot are in between. So over the years, I've watched how kind of that trend has gone. And I've noticed that today the complaints are a lot more informed. It used to be that the complaints were coming from people who didn't really understand Agile ideas, and they were kind of the Agile doubters. But increasingly, complaints are coming from people who do understand Agile. And they think, yeah, Agile is great, but, you know, they're thinking that kind of need to be fixed, that perspectives where all they talk about are behavioral process things. And the development issues, you know, the CI/CD issues don't come up. And people are afraid to bring them up because they think, well, the Scrum Master won't understand that. So it doesn't get discussed. And then they go back to their desks and they want to get back to work. So these important technical issues don't get talked about. And one of the big issues today, because systems are more distributed today, in the year 2000, the predominant paradigm was the three-tier architecture and basically monolithic systems. Today we have highly distributed systems. And so the issues tend to be in the integration between components, messages and asynchronous calls and hundreds or thousands of microservices. So integration is where it's at today, and which is much more than just a team issue. And so that's kind of fallen through the crack. And, there's so much attention in Agile planning to the backlog, but so insufficient and adequate attention to the development flow. I see in the consulting I do a lot of attention to organizations on architecture. That usually is not too much of an issue. Of course, is a generalization, but very often I see insufficient attention to the product level CI/CD issues, not component or team level, but product level. And another complaint that teams often have is there are too many distractions. They're in these big rooms with lots of noise and people walking around and talking, and they can't focus anymore. When I started development in the 80s, I had my own office. I worked at several companies. Each time I had my own office. And the general protocol was, you keep your door open, but if you really want to think and focus, you close your door. If your door's closed, no one will come in. And then when you're done thinking, you open it again. So somehow we've gone to the opposite extreme, where everyone is sitting in the middle of a bus station. And then the idea of too many meetings so as another complaint. And there's some root causes there. And actually, that's a complex subject, but the too many meetings issue can be fixed. But anyway, let's go on. Another complaint is, there's an assumption in Scrum that a development team is like a sports team. And I don't feel a development team is like a sports team. A sports team, you want to get all charged up and run out to the field. In development, you don't want to get charged up. If you're charged up, you can't think. You need to be calm. And developers often don't want to know what everybody else is working on. In my experience, what they do want to know is they want to know how it's going to fit together. But they don't want to know every day, oh, what's this person doing? What's that person doing? It doesn't matter. They only want to know if it affects them. That's, people are different. But the core assumption of the stand-up is everybody wants to know what everybody else is doing, and I would question that. And another core assumption is self-organization, that you just put a group of people together and then stand back, and that doesn't work very well often. But the idea of self-organization is really powerful in that you enable people to work in the way that's best for them. That's the core idea, and we don't want to lose that. But the extreme approach of just saying, oh, well, the team always knows and the team will figure it out, that doesn't work either. That's an extreme. Let me take a sip of tea. Another core assumption is that developers want to constantly be collaborating and reaching out to each other for ad hoc discussions. That's kind of an extrovert's view of the world. Developers generally, a lot of developers are introverts statistically, and they generally want to kind of do their own thing. And they reach out when they need to. They'll text message someone, hey, how does this work? I'm stuck on this. Can you look at it? But they don't want to constantly be collaborating, being interrupted all the time. And another kind of dysfunction that I see a lot is that, and a lot of the consulting I do is with big organizations where like each product will have 30 teams. There's a bank I did some work with recently. They have 500 teams, 500 software development teams. And you can't just create a bunch of teams and expect them to all coordinate and magically self-organize. They don't. They do a little bit, but not enough, not anywhere near enough. Someone needs to be kind of the organizer and making the coordination happen, and it doesn't have to be like a bossy autocratic person. It can be a very kind of open, inquiry-based approach, but someone needs to kind of take ownership of that or it doesn't happen. And then another thing that kind of got left out of Agile entirely is the issue of data. There's no mention of it. It's something that is data is as important as code. What is code without data? And yet there's no mention of anything pertaining or any kind of view of how you deal with data in the Agile manifesto. And then another thing that's kind of gone wrong is even though the Agile Manifesto begins with the word individual, the very first value is individual. And somehow in the community, it's all become about the team. And every discussion I ever hear about in an Agile setting is always the team, the team, the team. Well, what about the individual? Both the team and the individual matter. Each needs kind of to be addressed and mentored and coached. Another thing that kind of went wrong is even though the Agile Manifesto very explicitly says in several places, that it's about the customer and customer value, somehow, and this might be really a Scrum phenomenon, it has become in many organizations, has become kind of a shoveling of the product owner is kind of this all-seeing kind of knower of what the product should do and just shovels features at the team. And the team becomes kind of like on a treadmill, just implement, 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 kind of this one directional flow of commands. And then, what if the team has ideas for the product? Because the team might know the technology better and they might realize if they really understood what the user does, they might have suggestions. But they're in the Agile models and methodology or frameworks, there usually is not kind of an assumption that teams will have ideas for the product. It's usually assume that teams will just implement. And knowing, and teams often have no interaction with real users. So how can they have an understanding of how people are actually going to use things? So these are some issues, some things, complaints that we've heard. I've kept lists over the years. And these are kind of things that go wrong. Of course, this is not universal. Some places do things really well. But when things don't go well, these are some of the things that you hear from development teams about how they've experienced Agile. So we wanted to do something about this because there are people who are doing it right. Agile 2 is not new in that there's nothing new in it. There are no new ideas in Agile 2. It's practices, not practices, it's ideas and paradigms and realizations that have been around for a long time that people who have effective organizations actually use these ideas. And we wanted to collect these things together to put them under the envelope of Agile. Who are we? We're a group, there are 15 of us. And this group of people was created in order to span these kinds of expertise: product design, leadership, business, program management, engineering, human resources, professional coaching. And I mean real professional coaching. Not the 2-day course, but like the real thing. Software development, DevOps, and Agile, plus other things. But these are the main skill sets of this group. And these are all very experienced people. These people are not the typical Agile authors. These people are people who are accomplished in their domains, but they're not the quote unquote Agile thought leaders that you often read. And there's a reason for that. We specifically excluded that. In order to be in this group, you had to have demonstrated a tendency to think independently. And so people's writing was looked at. And not heavily invested in the Agile status quo, because the Agile field has been carved up into territories that are in effect owned by different groups. There's the Scrum Alliance, and then there's the SAFE group, and there's all these different groups, and they kind of own their territory. And people make a lot of money from that, and they have following in their blogs and so on based on that. And we didn't want that. We wanted to be independent. And so we specifically did not include people who are heavily invested in the current status quo, because we think the status quo is part of the problem. Now, the process that we used was essentially like this. Now, we kicked this off more or less just after COVID. And that actually was a watershed moment because it called attention to a key Agile idea that's predominant in the community, that you have to have in-person collaboration all the time. And COVID proved that you don't. It's clear some people really benefit from being in person. Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, recently said that there's no value in working remotely. You have to be in person or forget it. GitHub is an entirely remote organization, and they've done surveys of their community and found that people work remotely fantastically. So it depends who you ask. There's also probably a personality factor involved. So in any case, COVID kind of revealed, hey, working remotely can work, but maybe it's a complicated issue. But it's not a non-starter. It's the idea, oh, you always have to be in person is not true. So we thought that was kind of a good moment to launch this, because several of us have been waiting for the right moment for several years, because these problems are not new. There was an Agile retrospective done by the British Computer Society 10 years into the Agile movement. And if you look at their findings, it's really amazing, because their findings are essentially the same as what we find today. Nothing has really changed. The same problems. And the reason those same problems exist is because these different groups have carved up Agile, and they want to keep Agile the same. But what we did is, because there are 15 of us in different time zones, we have people in India, Australia, Vietnam, different parts of the US, some other place where people were all over. And so we couldn't have a group call. It just wasn't feasible. People have day jobs. And so we used a different approach. It was kind of an experiment, and luckily it worked. We did one-on-one calls and took detailed notes and shared those notes. And then we created email discussion threads on major topics that came up in the discussions. And then based on those discussions, we kind of extracted, common threads and, a set of insights. And based on that, we distilled out a set of principles, which we discussed through different email threads, and also shared Google documents. We used a lot of shared Google documents about different topics. And then, all converging, and we had several people draft different attempts at consolidating those ideas into a consistent set of principles. And we picked the best one. And then we worked iteratively to refine that. And then we went through a consensus process where everybody, agreed or disagreed with each principle. So we achieved consensus on our principles. And it took May, June, July, August, September. It took about 5 months to do that. We feel that the Agile community, various thought leaders had really great insights along the way, and it has continued to have great insights. But there are forces in the community that are stifling it, that want to sort of keep things as they are. And so we knew we had to go outside the community to some extent in order to break free of that. And also the ideas within Agile 2 have been tested pretty well over the last few years, because several of us have been writing articles about many of these topics and looking at the response. There was one article that I personally wrote in LinkedIn called Why Self-Organizing Teams Don't Work. And, of course, the title was designed to be kind of a catchy title. Self-organization does work under the right circumstances. If you train people to be able to self-organize and then provide some support and oversight, yeah, they can self-organize under those conditions. But in any case, the article had this kind of provocative title, and it received 46,000 reads in LinkedIn, which is a large number for LinkedIn. Most of those reads within the first 2 weeks, over 400 comments. And the majority of the comments were very supportive. So we realized, and also based on on things that were posted in programmer forums about Agile, we realized that there was a huge amount of kind of discontent with how things are being done in the Agile sphere. So we kind of knew what the response would be because we'd already been testing these ideas. So what are the ideas? Well, one idea is don't be extreme. When, depending on whether you live, in Europe or Asia or the US, 20 years ago, there were movements to kind of be more agile, be more iterative. Here in the US, I remember it clearly because I lived through it. So I'll just share that. One of my colleagues, Adrian Lander, I think was in Asia at the time. I think actually he was in Singapore, if I'm not mistaken. The kind of arc that this went through was different for different regions. But in the US, it was extreme programming. When extreme programming came out in 1999/2000, it created kind of this huge earthquake. Suddenly, everybody in the IT community was talking about it. And it kind of set the tone, at least in the US, Agile. The Agile Manifesto was written 2 years later, but extreme programming had really set things in a direction of be extreme. And that became culturally embedded. And ironically, if you read the Agile Manifesto, it's not extreme. It's really about judgment and guidance. It says we value this, but we value this more. It's really kind of saying, let's be calm and thoughtful. But people didn't read it that way because the tone had been set. It was all about being extreme. And so they read it in an extreme way. The Agile Manifesto says the best results come from self-organizing teams. Well, that doesn't say all teams should be self-organizing. And it doesn't say that you don't need a lot of steps to enable a team to become self-organizing, but people read it that way. What they read was, oh, self-organized, don't have any appointed leader, just throw a bunch of people together and stand back. And that doesn't work. That's too extreme. These practices or ideas of Agile are sophisticated. And in order to apply them intelligently, you have to have experience and judgment about these things. And that's what got lost. So don't be extreme is one of the themes in Agile too. The way that Agile is interpreted in the Agile community very frequently is everyone must meet face to face for every issue. Well, not necessarily. Some issues, like very often if I have to discuss branching and merging strategy, especially involving multiple repos with teams, it turns out it's a lot more effective to kind of write down some proposed approaches and circulate that first. And then when people have had a chance to digest that and maybe send some emails with counter ideas, then maybe it's a good time to meet. But the written part is really important in that case because it's a complicated, multifaceted issue. If you just jump into a face-to-face discussion, you'll swirl and the meeting will be over before you get anywhere. So it depends on the issue. Face-to-face is usually important, but so is written communication. There are other forms of communication that matter too. Be thoughtful about it. Teams must self-organize. That self-organization is an aspiration because it gives teams the ability to be more autonomous and that enables you to react more quickly if you can count on teams to be able to just do what needs to be done. But a lot of work needs to go into getting a team to that point. That's a long discussion, but it's not something you can just throw a bunch of people together and stand back. Autonomy. Everyone must pair program. So, extreme programming was very heavy on pair programming, and some people love it. Some people absolutely hate it. Don't force them. Don't be extreme. Sometimes you hear in the Agile community, oh, pair programming is the best practice. Everybody who's really Agile should be doing that. No, it depends. Some people do not pair well. Some people like to think before they type. Some other people like to type and then look and then see how it went. And in the sciences, there's this dichotomy between experimentalists and theorists, where experimentalists like to try something and then look at the result, and then they refactor that. They then generalize. Theorists like to start out with the general and then derive the more detailed. It's a different way of thinking. And that same dichotomy exists within IT. And I believe that's why some people pair well and some don't. You can't put a thinker together or two thinkers together and expect them to sit at a keyboard, because a thinker first wants to think before they type. And if you put a thinker and a doer together, then the doer will just take over. The thinker will end up just not contributing. And another kind of Agile extreme is only the team as a whole ever receives any recognition. The Agile community is very negative about any individual recognition, but that's unfair. People, especially developers tend to value their ideas a lot. Like if you talk to a salesperson and say, was that your idea? They'll say, I don't care. We won the deal. That's all I care about. But IT people generally do care about that it was their idea. That is very important to them. And if you read Daniel Pink's book about drive, he mentions that ideas are very important to some people. Acknowledgement, it was their idea. It really matters to them. And so this idea, only the team, is unfair to people. People do deserve recognition for their ideas and their individual contributions. But what you don't want is, you don't want the toxic team hero who always saves the day and holds on to information so they're the critical person and no one can do anything without them. That's another extreme that really destroys the team. But that doesn't mean that you should throw out the idea that no one receives individual acknowledgement. Another aspect of Agile too is leadership. Someone interviewed me for a blog recently, and at the end of the blog, he said, what are some, the 3 things you advise for any startup? And I said, well, it's clear. The 3 things are leadership, leadership, and leadership. It's like in real estate. What are the 3 things that matter? Location, location, and location. It's the only thing that matters. If you have the right leadership, it doesn't matter what methodology you use, because with the right leadership, you will converge to a process that works best for you. If you have bad leadership, no methodology will work. Bad leadership will undermine any methodology. It's all about leadership. And what you don't want is the dictatorial, autocratic, narcissistic leadership. You want leaders who are helpful and think in terms of what problems are you having today? How are things working end to end? What are your ideas? Oh, that's a good idea. Or what about this and what about that? And where, someone who facilitates Socratic discussion, where the best idea wins, no matter whose idea it was. That's the kind of leadership that is really effective for teams. There are other modes of leadership. You also need leadership that advocates for the team, that focuses outward. You also need within the team, very often, if it's a technical team, like a development team, you need technical thought leadership, which doesn't have to all come from one person. But you might need someone who kind of is the arbiter, who makes the final decision about key technical issues. You might, you might not. Leadership is a complex issue, and leadership is what it's all about. The Agile has a culture of being against leadership. It wants this kind of democratic process where everybody has a vote, which is really unfair to people who have decades of experience. On the other hand, you don't want an environment in which only the most experienced people can voice ideas. You want every idea to have a chance. So everyone needs to be respected, regardless of how much or how little experience they have. But experience does count for something. It does. So it's complicated. And, with good leadership, you will have the right kind of facilitation. And sometimes leaders do need to make decisions because accountability is another thing that's important. In order to scale Agile, you cannot have entire teams being accountable. You have to have individuals, or it just doesn't work. If someone spends money, a manager spends money, they're accountable for what they've spent. You can't make a group accountable. But that's a long discussion too. That gets into holacracy and all of that. But leadership, however you structure it, leadership is the definer. It's, if you have good leadership, whatever that looks like, things will go well. Product design is another thing that got left out of Agile, which is interesting because, as I mentioned, the Agile Manifesto talks a lot about the customer. Really, I think they mean the user, because the customer and the user aren't always the same. But I think that, the general idea was, the people who are actually going to use the stuff, presumably they're buying it or someone's buying it for them. The people who are actually going to use it, should be involved and have a say about what it does. And the goal should be to try to please them. That was the kind of central idea in the Agile Manifesto. But somehow, I think, again, through Scrum has become all about the product owner and this like individual who somehow knows what the product's supposed to do and says nothing about the actual user, which is a huge dysfunction. And I've been in many organizations where the product owner wasn't even involved in defining the product vision, which was done by a separate marketing team. But this kind of order-taking approach of the product owner, like shoveling stories to be implemented toward a development team, is very 1980. It doesn't allow for feedback loops. It's not that you can't add those on, but a framework should have all the things that you might need. Just saying, oh, well, it's a framework and you have to add on other things to make it actually work. That's an incomplete framework. That's a bad framework because it misleads you. It doesn't tell you what you don't know. It doesn't tell you the things you should consider. And successful companies like Agile do not work that way. Like Apple. Successful companies like Apple and Google and Netflix and so on, they don't try to be Agile, quote unquote, with a capital A. They just try to get stuff done. They don't care what it's called. Apple has a design group, and it's a huge function within Apple. Not everybody is, it's kind of a secret function. They do their work in secret, and they come out with these ideas, and then people like vet the ideas. But it's their own process. They came up with that. And design is usually important, but design somehow got left out of Agile, which doesn't mean you can't add it on. And design really should be more user-centric. There's a paradigm called participative design, where you actually kind of embed with the users and get them to articulate ideas for the product. And you try to understand what it is they actually are trying to do. And you look at the user as someone to empower, not as someone to automate and replace. And that process is really important, and it leads to really powerful product ideas. And so we need that. That needs to be part of Agile. And if you add on the development cycle, there should be feedback loops all over the place. So we added that to Agile too. That you have to include the users and you have to focus on product design. And there are different models for that. You can have what's called a dual track approach or an integrated approach. And there are other models too. But however you do it, it needs to be in there. And there need to be feedback loops. And the developers need to have some level of interaction with real users so that they understand what it is the users are actually doing and how they're using the product and what job they're actually trying to do. Business stakeholders need to understand how the product is built. You cannot have business stakeholders saying, oh, well, that's technical, I don't need to know that. it might be the case for some issues, but in general, they do need to know how the thing is built. And the reason they need to know is because today, time to market is very important. It's a strategic advantage, how quickly they can pivot and add new features. Because, business stakeholders are often in the position of saying, making a trade-off versus a new feature versus improving the delivery process. The tech teams might say, well, we want to spend some sprints improving our process. And the business might say, well, I want these features. And the business is, at least in the Scrum process, is ultimately in charge of that decision. And how can they make that decision correctly if they don't understand how the product's being built? Because they need to understand how improving that process will give them something, will give them better time to market or better quality. So they have to take an interest in knowing how the product is built. They have to. Otherwise, they don't know the full picture, because how it is built is part of the product. It's how quickly it can be, new features can be delivered. The process of delivering new versions to the market is part of the product. And technical stakeholders need to understand how the product is used, because otherwise they can't anticipate how users might want the product to actually work. And they won't be in a position of thinking of ideas, like as they're building the product, they might think of ideas, well, there's this new capability that I know about, that new technical capability. What if we use that in order to enable the users to do this or that better? If they're not in a position to make suggestions like that, then you're going to lose out on all the ideas that they might have based on their knowledge of new kinds of technology. Another thing is that data is strategic. We identified 3 ways in which data is really important, and none of it is mentioned. It's really downplayed within the Agile community, like an afterthought. But data is front and center. Data is what made Google. Data is what powers the world today. How can you not mention data? How can you not build your entire framework and way of looking at this around data? It'd be like talking about cars without talking about wheels. Data is huge, probably the most important thing of all today. And one way in which it's important is that I've seen many times development teams have microservices that that maintain their own data stores. But then, the microservice might broadcast events, that are received by a data lake, that gets stored, for a kind of history. But very often those events, have data that is just kind of dumped into a data lake without any kind of metadata or schema or anything maintained. And a friend of mine who's a machine learning expert, who works at a very large company, I'm not going to name, he said that he cannot do his job because they have this data lake with all kinds of uncorrelatable data in it. It's just a big cesspool. And in order for him to develop machine learning, in order for him to test hypotheses for machine learning, he needs the data to be correlatable across different services, different parts of the data lake, and he can't make heads or tails of the data. So that means that the organization's data cannot be leveraged as a strategic asset. Another way that data is important is that development teams are often expected to just start coding, when very often there's transactional data that is coming from other systems, or via APIs very often today, or events, and they need to understand that. And so there's a substantial learning curve there. And increasingly there's a trend today to not document those sources. For teams to just, they create the Swagger API or Open API or whatever, or a message, a message JSON, but with no explanation for what the fields actually are. It's really kind of kind of awful. And another way that data is important is that I was in a program meeting with a bunch of development leads, and I heard one of the development leads. I love this quote because it so illustrates the problem. One of the development leads said to another, well, our tests always pass because, of course, we create data that we know will pass. And he kind of chuckled, but his point was actually really important, really valid, because, of course, they're not going to create data that won't pass. The data they create reflects their understanding of what the thing should do. If their understanding is wrong, their test data will also be wrong, but their test will pass. And that's why it's really important to have real production-like data. And guess who is in the best position to provide that? The business stakeholders who own the data, who own the operational data. And too often, they just assume the teams will somehow obtain that data when the business should take responsibility for providing data sets of production-like data. Team autonomy is another issue that we wanted to address, because we often hear today the model that development teams should be autonomous, self-organizing teams. And it's just assumed by too many people that that's an absolute, an extreme, that the team is entirely autonomous and entirely self-organizing. And that's almost never the case any place where this works well. It's not the case at Netflix. It's not the case at Google. That despite the fact that they describe it that way, that's not what really happens. I know because I've investigated those, and Amazon as well, and Microsoft. Teams cannot be fully autonomous in a complex product because there are dependencies. Dependencies require collaboration. In order to ensure that things integrate, you have to have practices that make sure that things integrate. Those practices can be collaborative or they can be largely automated, but you have to have them. So it's not a situation of full autonomy. Autonomy requires demonstrating that the team can integrate their work with the work of other teams in a way that other teams consider to be satisfactory. In other words, the product works at a product level. And the team also represents the risk management concerns of the organization. If a team is autonomous, you'd better be confident that they're using, that they're adhering to any regulatory or security-based concerns with regard to what they develop. So autonomy should be something that you prove you can do, not just something that's assumed out of the gate. Autonomy is a goal. Autonomy is an extremely important thing, but it's something to work toward, not to just grant. Another kind of cultural aspect of the Agile community that we feel needs fine-tuning is the relentless focus on more and more collaboration. Collaboration is extremely important. The focus on collaboration was a result of the 1990s practice of having one group develop a bunch of requirements documents and then handing that to developers and saying, here you go. And then the requirements weren't consistent and were hard to understand, and it was just too much in written form and no one to ask questions to. That's a really, really awful approach. But the opposite approach of saying, well, we'll just talk about it all the time, that's a bad approach too. And most of what developers do requires focus. And that means no one's talking nearby. And that's, that important element of development has been lost on the Agile community, the importance of being able to focus. And that's why you see so many people wearing headphones today, because they're just trying to focus. The focus on generalists is really good. Generalists are very valuable on a team. That's a great insight, that you want T-shaped people who are really good at some things, but can do almost anything that needs doing. So that way, no one ever has to wait. Waiting is one of the lean wastes, and waiting kills a development flow. But for today's complex products, you also need experts. A machine learning expert, if there are two ways of doing machine learning. One is to use out-of-the-box models using services from Google and Amazon and so on. And any developer can do that. But if you're developing your own custom model, for that, you need machine learning experts. And those are mathematicians. They're not programmers. They might know how to write some Python, but programming is not what they do. What they do is build models, and they work with data and these neural network weighting models. And those people are experts. You generally have to have a PhD to work in that space. So, you're not going to have a person like that gradually coach a team so they can transfer their knowledge to the team. That's not going to work. That person is a true expert. It's like a doctor is not going to coach someone to turn that other person into a doctor. It takes, years of learning of very advanced mathematics in the case of machine learning. And those are true experts, and that, they're not substitutable. They're not generalists. So, teams need ways to work with experts. That's an important part for today's products. And also, sometimes they're experts who you don't need full time, like a security expert, and having them work as an extended team member is a very effective way to do it sometimes. So the point is that generalists are very important, but so are experts. And the Agile needs to explicitly acknowledge that experts have a role, and there needs to be a way to account for experts. And I mentioned, teams and individuals both matter. Team spirit and making teams effective is really important. Teams of generalists, but who can also incorporate experts. But individuals matter too, because a team is made of individuals. And individuals want to know that they can advance in their work, that they can accumulate experience and maybe get a promotion or get new opportunities, or they can learn how to become a team lead. They want to have a career path. They want advancement. And they also want individual mentorship sometimes. When everybody's in an open room, how can you provide individual mentorship to someone? You can't have a real heart-to-heart conversation with them right there. You'd have to find a room or schedule it and everything. Whereas, maybe it would be good if you could have a senior manager swing by and have a private conversation with you. Hey, I'm the one who hired you. How are things going? And if you're sitting out in the open, how are you going to do that? Not enough thought has been given to the individual within Agile settings. The individual needs attention too, not just the individual is not just a faceless team member. Another thing, and this is something that there is pretty wide consensus about in the Agile community. That transformation is mostly a learning journey, but we wanted to make that part of Agile too, to make it explicit. Very often, managers who got their experience 10, 20 years ago might have experience with like Y2K transitions, or other kinds of transformations that were just a process re-engineering rollout. And that does not work for Agile, as I'm sure most of the attendees here know, because most of Agile is about judgment. It's about experiencing situations and then having an Agile mindset, an Agile way of looking at problems to come up with a solution. So it's about applying judgment. It's not about following steps. And that means that each person needs to learn new models and new ways of thinking, and then have practice, hopefully with an Agile coach for support to discuss things with, actually applying those ideas and see how it works out. And then that's experiential learning, trying things over time. And you cannot define that ahead of time as a process and just roll it out. So Agile coaches know that, but we wanted to make that kind of clarified and make that explicitly part of our set of Agile ideas. We also wanted to take the position that frameworks are extremely valuable, but they're not things you should just implement. Any framework is a set of ideas. It's not something you should say, we're going to take this framework and do exactly that. As an example, if you were to record how your neighbors deal with their family and their children and their grandparents and in-laws, and then use those same kinds of conversations and methods in your family, do you think it would work well? Maybe, but probably not. Probably not. And it's the same thing. Organizations are complex networks of people, and the issues differ from organization to organization. At a very high level, the issues are the same, but once you go down 1 or 2 levels, they're very different. And so these frameworks are models. They're not things to implement, and they should never, ever be used as something to just implement. They should only be used as a model to stimulate thinking about what you should actually do. That's a high-level summary of Agile 2. I just wanted to say, we purposefully did not write Agile 2 as a manifesto. We think there are enough manifestos. We think the original Agile manifesto is good if you read it properly with experience in mind and realize that there's a lot that's unsaid in it. And, we feel that also, the Agile 2 is not a short, like 1-pager. It's because we feel that these are complex issues, and part of the problem with the original manifesto is it tends to be misunderstood because of what it doesn't say. And so we wanted to be very clear. So each of our principles is explained. There's an explanation of each principle, and then supporting the principle, there's a whole set of ideas behind it, which we call problems and insights. And that shows the entire thought process used to come up with the principle. So that way someone can look at a principle and see why. What's the reason for that principle? And then you can decide, does that principle actually apply? Because in many situations, many principles will not apply. And so we cannot escape the fact that this is a thoughtful process, that one has to be contextually looking at each situation uniquely and not just applying some practice that someone else is doing. What can you do? So Agile 2 ideas are not new ideas. Some of these ideas have been around for literally thousands of years. I'm sure when the pyramids were built, people were using some of these ideas. So, the ideas in Agile 2, I've seen many of the ideas used. It has history already, even though it wasn't called Agile 2. You can create training. The content is not owned content. It's published under a Creative Commons license. You can write blog posts and articles about how you've used some of the ideas that are stated in Agile 2. There's a LinkedIn group, which is intended for people to share ideas and experiences, and you can tell others about it. You don't need certification. It's a set of ideas. And none of the ideas are controversial if you talk to people who are pragmatic people, rather than, the people who are highly committed to one of the frameworks will probably view Agile 2 with some skepticism, because again, it challenges the territorial view of Agile, where there are these different frameworks owned by different camps. It challenges that because Agile 2 is an open set of ideas. If you talk to people who are not dedicated to a particular framework, the response tends to be, oh, it's about time. Yeah, I've been thinking these things for a long time. This is not new to me. I think this is fantastic. That's generally the response we get from people who are not dedicated to a specific framework. Okay. This is just a summary of what we talked about. Don't be extreme. Leadership's the most important thing. Product design is essential. Dev teams need to be partners, not order takers. No one can have blinders on. I don't need to know about that. Data strategic. Team autonomy is important, but it's an aspiration, not an absolute. collaboration, and focus are both important. Generalists are important, but so are experts. Both teams and individuals matter. Transformation is mostly a learning journey, not a process rollout. And frameworks are very valuable, but they should be viewed as sets of ideas and models, not things to implement. Thank you very much for taking the time. I'm very interested in any feedback that anyone might have. I don't know if there's a Q&A. Let me stop sharing my screen. Oh, I see there are a lot of questions. There's a lot in the chat. So able to maybe identify some things that some people have said, or maybe questions or that anyone might have. I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Okay, I'll just look at the most recent thing. Someone wrote, this is fantastic. For example, my teams always have experts and it drove me crazy that I was supposed to make them all generalists. Involvement. Involvement of experts was long been through with the chicken and pig paradigm. Yeah, some people are chickens and some people are pigs. Yeah, and one of them gets slaughtered. I know. I like the extended team member model. Because they all have skin in the game. They're all involved to some degree. I mean, it's a product. Let's see. Some of your points are agreeable, but the Agile we also have known so far, for example, a mix of generalists and specialists, similar to team and individuals coaching. Yeah, I agree. I think, people who do Agile well do these things. None of this is new. We just wanted, there's a lot of misinterpretation of Agile, and we wanted to take what people actually are doing who do this well and kind of make it specific. I mean, make it explicit. When people make Agile really work, this is how they do it. That's what we were attempting to do. Is Agile 2 going to be a replacement to existing frameworks? Agile 2 does not replace anything. Agile 2 is a set of ideas. It's a huge amount of overlap between Agile 2 and lots of other idea spaces. And it's just like any set of ideas. We want it to be something people think about. We don't want it to be some dogma where someone carries around the Agile 2 book saying, oh, we only do what's in here. In fact, on the Agile 2 website, we even say, please read other things. Please read other ideas as well. We just think these things also should be things that are front and center when you think about Agile. Someone once told me I'm not, because I recognize it's a continuum to strive towards, not a defined procedure. Yeah, so the release to production daily is kind of a DevOps concept. And there's several reasons for that practice, but there's no definition of you're Agile or you're not Agile. It depends. Maybe releasing to production daily. What if you're building a spaceship? Are you going to release to production daily? So does that mean you can't build spaceships in an Agile manner? Of course you can. So, you have to be thoughtful. I have done work in the hardware space myself, and companies that build machines, engines and tractors and vehicles and things like that, boats, and as well as microchips. And in those spaces, Agile looks different. But the core ideas are, try to iterate quickly and early, so that you find problems early. Sometimes it's hard, like in the hardware space, if you have embedded software, it's time consuming to flash a ROM and rerun embedded software on an actual chip. So you're not going to do that many times a day, but you will do it with some frequency. And what you might do many times a day is you might simulate using a virtual machine or some kind of simulation you might do, but that's kind of, that's a less robust test. It's a less trustworthy kind of test. It's kind of like running a local integration test on your laptop versus running an actual integration test in a data center or a cloud using like the real kind of stuff. Why do so many people write Scrum with a capital letter? Well, because Scrum is a process that was defined by some individuals. It's a proper noun. You might be asking about Agile. Some people write Agile with a capital A. I do myself. And Dave Thomas, one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto, doesn't like that. He says Agile is active, but it is also a proper noun today in vernacular. It's become part of the language because when people say Agile today, it's like shorthand for Agile development or Agile software development, which is their Agile is an adjective. But you can talk about Agile. When people say Agile, what they mean is either the Agile community or the set of ideas advocated by the Agile community. So that has become a noun. That's just the reality. Dave Thomas can't do anything about that, even though he doesn't like it. It's the reality. We just have to accept it. Agile is in vernacular. It's just the way it is.
I wonder if I could jump in with a quick interactive question. So you were talking about Agile there. I think there's a tendency these days to talk about agility versus Agile. So when you want to talk about a document or something, you want to talk about a noun, a thing, talk about Agile. But when you want to talk about the continuum of agility, where am I and in which direction am I going? Am I getting more Agile or less Agile? I think agility becomes a far more useful word to use.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Because agility agility is a noun, but it's descriptive. And it's saying you have agility, and that's the goal, right? I mean, that is a goal. If you have a business goal, it might be you want more agility. It might be you want more quality. Agility usually translates into shorter time to market, but it's closely related to quality too, because you can pivot more frequently. You can test ideas more frequently. So it is kind of a valid goal. What?
I think critically for me, it's on a continuum. And so what the question should be is, are we getting more Agile or less Agile, right? Are we heading in the right direction? And that's a far, far better way of looking at things than, are we in a place that we call a false dichotomy?
Exactly, because Agile with a capital A is not the goal. It's just a set of ideas. It's a way of looking at a problem. There are lots of other sets of ideas, like Lean and many others. It's just a set of ideas.
But Cliff, I probably may not agree that leadership was not given preference. Leadership was not given preference in Agile. In Agile, they clearly said, yes, it's a balancing act, and how much of leadership you require is contextual, highly contextual, right? If you have a 500 team member, you definitely require leadership. So especially the writings of Jim Hicksmith, they talked about, he clearly talked about having leadership, and he talked about agility is about balancing act, if you may recall, right?
Yeah.
So I probably would not agree to that.
Well, I agree with what you said. If you talk to various individuals, people who are experienced and thoughtful about this have been doing these things. The idea of leadership is not new. Jim Highsmith, of course, was one of the authors of the manifesto. But I have it on, I wasn't at the Snowbird meeting, but I have it from a reliable source that there was one individual in particular there who very much championed a kind of anti-management approach to the manifesto, and that might be why it ended up being written the way it was. And I think people who have experience in actually doing these things and getting results, they tend to read the manifesto differently than someone who doesn't have that experience. And that's, I think, the problem. It's not that, it's the problem is what the manifesto doesn't say. It doesn't talk about leadership, and it needs to. But people who are experienced will read the manifesto, and they'll read self-organizing teams, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I know it says that, but what they really mean is this." So that ambiguity, we think we're trying to address some of that ambiguity. We're not saying the Agile Manifesto is wrong. We're saying there's some really powerful ideas there, but here are some things that kind of fill it out and flesh it out and add some nuance to it.
All right. Thanks.
Let's see, yes, there are some points that are truly required to be brought in. Some of your points are also agreeable by the Agile we've known so far. We're getting into another traditional style. I think it's fair to say that what's being now called Agile turned out to be a set of rules carved in stone. I'd like to address that unless someone has another question. I'll leave it at that. But being part of the DevOps community, I watched. My concern. I embraced extreme programming from the beginning, but I was concerned. My job was CTO of our company, and we did things fixed price, and we did some big stuff. We built McKesson Pharmaceuticals, first platform that all their pharmacies would order through. We built platforms for various banks, American Express. We did really big stuff, and it had to work. And we built our own performance lab in-house on our own dollar, which I ran. And if something didn't work, our best engineer had to go out to the customer site to get it to work, and that person couldn't start another project. And so it would really cost us. So my focus was very much, and I was very worried about security. I organized some security conferences, and I want to make sure things really work. And whenever we would start a new project, I would get the team in a room, and I would ask them questions like, how is this going to work? And what about this? And what if that happens? To get them thinking. Because my terror was that we'd have some disaster. And I didn't see in the early days in the Agile community any fear of disaster. It was kind of this gung-ho, oh, let's just code new features and see what happens. And, I felt there needed to be more nuance to it. There needed to be, code new features, but test the heck out of it in an environment, and not just unit testing, but all kinds of testing. So I kind of started on a journey about that, and I ended up writing this book with Peter Neumann called High Assurance Design, which unfortunately, the title is kind of like focused on design, but it's really about applying, what works in an agile way. I came to the conclusion that, because the approach at the time for security and reliability was this very like process heavy top-down approach. And I knew that couldn't work in an agile setting. So I was thinking what would work is if just people know more. They know design patterns that are secure and are reliable. So the book is really all about design patterns. And I noticed that when people like Jez Humble were going to Agile talks, we're giving Agile talks at Agile events, the talks were well attended, but somehow what he was talking about with continuous delivery didn't make it back to Agile coaches in general. I didn't hear any buzz about it. All the buzz was about like less and safe and all the conflict, controversy around that and about being Agile instead of doing Agile. But I didn't hear any buzz in the Agile community about continuous delivery. And indeed, I think he kind of gave up, because DevOps, became its own thing. And today, if you talk to DevOps people, they don't know much about Agile. And if you talk to Agile coaches, they generally don't know much about DevOps. And that's a dysfunction. Those need to be brought together. And that's why I have a course that I developed called DevOps for Agile Coaches. And I actually teach them just enough programming so they can actually do deployments and actually do integration tests in ECS clusters and things like that, because they need to understand those issues so they can participate in conversations. They don't have to be experts at it. They don't need to be engineers, but they need to take an interest and just have experienced that stuff so they can follow along and ask questions. So why aren't we doing this and why aren't we doing that? And ask those and have retrospectives that talk about that stuff. So, I think what happened, these frameworks like Scrum, I don't want to pick on Scrum, but it kind of was kind of the poster child for this. This community of evangelists was born around it, and it kind of froze the Agile community, kind of frozen in place around certain ideas and certain practices. You must do this and you must do that. And that stifled the evolution of Agile. Agile should have evolved into DevOps, and then DevOps and Agile would be the same. And it would be this rich thing that encompasses behavior and technical practices and all the things involved. But today it's like it's this division. There's Agile and there's DevOps, two totally separate things. Even though Jez Humble, the first to talk about continuous delivery, views himself as an Agilist, and his seminal book, Continuous Delivery, uses the word Agile more than 40 times. I know because I counted. But somehow DevOps became its own thing. And we need to fix that. We need to bring them back together. Agile coaches need to read some books on DevOps, and DevOps people need to learn about Agile. But I'm afraid if they read about Agile, they'll kind of like scratch their heads, because some of Agile is written in a very extreme way. And they need to read something more balanced, because DevOps people are very practical. If they read, oh, we should all go collaborate in an open space, they'll say, well, I don't want to do that, because they're mostly introverts. DevOps people are mostly people who want to stare at their screen all day. And so, we need kind of something that is more inclusive and that is broader and that acknowledges everybody's different. And there are lots of ways of working, and we need to take that into account. We need kind of a more sophisticated message, I think, to bring Agile and DevOps together.
Sorry, Cliff, can I just ask you a question on that? So I think Valentine, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, asked you the same question, and I'll reiterate it, but in a slightly different way. RUP, XP, take whatever methodology that you want, in its day became almost a religion, right? You had to do it that particular way, and you were castigated. You were told that you were bad for not doing it in that particular way. So what in Agile 2 allows us to pick and choose maybe what is appropriate, if that is indeed your aim? How do you make sure that it doesn't become prescriptive?
Yeah. So we talked a lot about that. There were various issues that spawned like durable discussion threads that we moved into Google Docs, and that was one of them. And you know, you can't control what people are going to do with something, you know, and you end up in like the kind of, you know, are you in the UK, Mike? Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm in the US, and as you know, in the US, because I know it's reported in your news, because I read like The Guardian, I read London, the Times every day, and I try and not just read American stuff. And you know, in the US, there's this huge division between gun owners, and it's like there's like no listening to each other. It's like a complete chasm. And, you know, so we can't control what people are going to do with something. And we, you know, because, you know, that, you know, the gun right advocates will say, well, it's our freedom, and the gun control advocates, and they'll say, oh, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And it's true, but then there's a counter argument about proliferation of guns, and that you swirl around and around and around. And, you know, prescriptiveness is something that we realized that we couldn't control what people were going to do with it, you know, and, you know, it's like you can't control what people are going to do with guns, but you can talk to it. You know, we wanted to do something about it. And so what we decided is the only power we have is the power of persuasion. So we thought, we'll just speak directly to that issue. And so we say in several places, there's several principles about not being prescriptive and about frameworks. There's a whole category about frameworks, that frameworks are only sets of ideas and nothing more, and that you have to be contextual. And we just speak to it. That's all we thought we could do.
I agree with both things that you said there. Second Amendment is an interesting topic at the best of times. But yeah, I'm not sure what is a well-regarded or well-controlled militia or whatever. Anyway, but I think when I was reading through the principles, for example, you had to go to other pages and other avenues to find that there is an attempt to at least say, pick and choose what you believe in, right? As opposed to something right at the top of the values and principles page that says, these are not prescriptive. And the other thing that I had a question about, I guess, is the use of the word principle. So principle is a rule that needs to be enforced, is my colloquial understanding of it. And a lot of these seem to be best practices. And the nuance there is that a best practice can be adopted if you agree with it, whereas a principle is something you kind of have to apply almost whether you like it or not. Though I guess that's overstating the point a little.
Yeah, actually, we've had some other feedback on that. I actually took some notes on what you just said. But, you know, one of the, you know, some of the feedback that we had was that, you know, principle sounded like it was too definitive, whereas the intent was that the principles are principles that might apply. You know, that in any given situation, some will apply and some won't. And that the principles are not hard and fast, they're not rules. They're, you know, that none of these things are true 100% of the time. When dealing with human behavior, you almost cannot make any rule that's true 100% of the time. I mean, look at the 10 Commandments. There's a situation in which one could potentially violate any rule of the 10 Commandments. Although I don't want to get into that debate, but you know, the principles were intended to be kind of like, like realizations, but not absolutes. So that's good feedback. We might need to make an adjustment there.
Yeah, just one really quick thing, and I realize I'm monopolizing this, so sorry, everybody. But I think my understanding is this came almost bottom up, right? So it came from the experiences of the participants that were making up this. So it was a real grassroots level initiative, as it were. And that's why I think a lot of these are practices, things that you found that work. And so you're trying to bring your experience and knowledge to say to other people, this is what we found, take of that what you will. And to me, that's not a principle. Though I think if you apply, say, 5 whys, for example, you can distill a lot of these into principles and values. And then I think even further than that, a goal, right? You've got to have a mission, something that you're trying to achieve that you use all of this stuff for at the end of the day. Anyway, that's the last I'm going to say, but thank you everybody for being tolerant.
Well, unless someone else has a comment, I'll leave a pause.
Yep. Cliff, I have a quick question. I've been in IT for over 30 years, a developer all the way up to a director, but have never used Agile intentionally. But I'm pivoting because of COVID, and I see how important it is to understand this whole world of Agile. How would you recommend giving what you're working on someone like myself to get started from the ground up, total newbie? What direction would you push me in? What would you have me read? What class would you have me take? And thank you so much for this talk today. It was excellent.
Sure. Well, it's a journey. Agile is not, on the one hand, it's not something you can learn quickly because it is a way of thinking. But on the other hand, it's, as I said, many ideas in Agile are as old as the pyramids, I'm sure of it. I read a book some time back called The Rockefeller Habits, and it was about Nelson Rockefeller. And I was really shocked. I don't know if the book's accurate or not, but everything in the book sounded like it came from the Agile community. So, of course, there are a lot of ideas that aren't very Agile, Taylorist, but sometimes things are misconstrued, like Taylorism. Apparently, when I think it was Frederick Taylor, I think was his first name, developed those ideas, he saw it as a way to empower workers, that he thought people would become process experts. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. But I would just encourage you to read a number of sources and not expect to come up to speed quickly. I would suggest read. There's one book, You Are in IT. Is that correct, Laurie? There's a book by Klaus Leopold, his most recent book that I really liked, that is non-technical. I'm not sure, is your background technical or would you say non-technical?
It was very technical, but then
it was technical.
It evolved more into a leadership role where it was not so technical.
Okay, well, I would encourage you, if you have a technical I would encourage anyone to also read some DevOps material. And, because, Agile and DevOps, Agile has turned into kind of the process side of things, the human side. And DevOps turned into just the reality, turned into the technical side. They're both important. And these ideas do work for, I've looked closely at what SpaceX does because it's kind of like the hardest case for building a product using Agile methods. How the heck can you build spaceships using Agile methods? Well, it turns out what they do is extremely Agile. So it's not just limited to software. There's a book we're writing about Agile too, and there's going to be a chapter about healthcare and also about human resources. There's an initiative called People Ops, which tries to apply Agile ideas to human resources. But I would encourage you, I would recommend Klaus Leopold's book in any case. I forget the name of it. it has a controversial name, something like Agile doesn't give you business value or something like that, but it's actually a book. It's sort of like Agile is good, but you have to be looking at it this way. I would recommend that, and I would recommend also one of, since you're technical, Jez Humble has written some really good stuff. I would recommend some of his stuff.
Okay, thank you so much. Is there any class you could recommend, or is it not ready yet for Agile 2 or for?
No, there's no training for Agile 2. We've been talking about it. That wasn't the goal, but I've been talking to David Anderson about this. He's the Kanban person, and he says you have to have training or no one's going to learn it. So we're starting to think, well, maybe we just have to create some training. But I don't know. But if we do create training, it won't be fluff training. It'll be the real thing. It'll be experiential. It'll be based on learning theory. It'll be hard. There'll be tests or projects or something. It'll be value. We'll try to make it the real thing if we do create that. So.
And last question, pending creating that training, can you direct me to any existing training that might be valuable? I know everything, it's so vast, but for someone just getting started, but with a very extensive technical background.
Well, Agile 2 is new. We just released it in October. So there won't be anything that says Agile 2 on it, except the book that's coming out in early March. It'll be through Wiley. But in terms of training, I would look at the DASA curriculum. It's the DevOps Agile Skills Association. And their framework, their knowledge framework is pretty well-rounded. They're currently developing a leadership curriculum. Actually, you know what book talks a lot about the leadership element is Jez Humble and Jean Kim and I forget her name. She's a researcher, came out with a book called Accelerate. It's called Accelerate, and that talks about Agile and DevOps adoption from a kind of capability model viewpoint, which at first threw me, but because I don't like capability models for this. But if you read it, their capabilities actually are not capabilities. They're about how you do the capabilities. And that's what matters, because Agile is not what you do, it's how you do it. So I would look at the book Accelerate. I would definitely pick up Klaus Leopold's book. His book's a quick read. You can read it in an afternoon, but it's got some really good stuff in it. And I would definitely look at both Agile and DevOps stuff because they're inseparable. And if you're technical, the DevOps stuff will probably resonate very strongly with you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah, if one thing is surprising me here in this conversation, the overall conversation is we are talking about DevOps, okay, we're talking about leadership and all this stuff. However, we have not touched on the area of technical practices. So the whole idea of being agile is we deliver today something to the market as quickly as possible, excuse me, and respond as fast as possible. So in order that you respond as quickly as possible, you need to have a code which is highly testable, highly maintainable, adaptable, and scalable. I hope you agree with that. With that. Consequently, you need to have practices like TDD or BDD, any of the other technical practices. I think rigor should be there in that area as well.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I was a bit surprised that there was not a mention of that.
Yeah. So we realized, one of the things we decided after a lot of discussion was, an issue early on was whether to make Agile 2 about software or to make it more general. And we concluded that, Agile 2, whether we like it or not, Agile has become general. People have been applying Agile ideas to all kinds of things. I had a friend who actually used it in his marriage, although it didn't work, but but he had things on his refrigerator, a Kanban board on his refrigerator about things they should do to improve their relationship. But it sounds like a good idea. I don't know, but you know, so we realize that whether we like it or not, people are using Agile ideas outside of software. And so it's not our choice. If we choose to not speak to those things, we're self-limiting and cutting out, you know, whole communities that are trying to use these ideas. So we explicitly made Agile 2 not just about software. That said, there is a strong focus on software and product development in particular, but it's not limited to that. And you know, just like some of the principles might apply in some situations, some might not. Some of the things that do speak to the things that you mentioned, Murali, we have principles related to continuous improvement. And one of them is to integrate early and often. And we explain that by integrate, you know, we don't necessarily mean run tests. We mean pull your work together. Like suppose a team of people is writing a chapter for a book. Well, they need to integrate early and often. You know, they need to track changes, and they need to, you know, collaborate early, and so that you don't have a whole bunch of big mismatches at the end. So we thought that was general enough. We didn't want to have practices in Agile 2. We only wanted to have what we call principles. And I very much hear, you know, Mike's comment that maybe our principles actually are practices. I'll have to give that some thought. But our goal was to be above the practice level. We didn't want to like be too prescriptive, because, you know, someone can always come up with other practices that work better. I agree with you that, like, you know, testing early and having a rigorous process for quality that focuses on early validation and early integration and being comprehensive enough. That's huge. That's in my DevOps course. That's a huge focus. And I feel that today the real challenge is integration testing, because I've collected data on that, and I found 80% of the problems in microservice-based systems tend to be integration issues. And so, you know, integration testing needs to be a huge focus. But, you know, that's very specific to a certain domain. So that's why we don't have very specific things like that.
All right, thanks. Thanks for clarifying.
Oh, okay. 5 seconds if there's someone else for a question.
Yeah, I think it was a 90-minute session, and we are now 47 minutes running out. But yeah, maybe you can pick a last few questions also, because I think people are still available.
Hi, please. This is Ramesh from India, Chennai. I have just one query. We have different any alliance plan in Agile to space.
I'm sorry, is the question is regarding Scrum? What is the question?
The Scrum space, we have alliances, Agile alliances, Scrum alliances, and lots of user groups. Is there any such approved groups planned or approved for Agile too? Hope I am well audible to you.
Davis, do you hear? Did you hear?
I think, Cliff, it's regarding the Agile user group.
Otherwise, I'll put you on chat, Cliff.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we have not created any meetups or user groups pertaining to Agile 2, because we didn't want to branch off Agile and create yet another division. Someone just posted a comment, using Agile in marriage, not sure if failing quickly is a good idea. Very good point. But about about, Ramesh's question. Yeah, there's a LinkedIn group for Agile 2. But, we're hoping that Agile 2 will become part of the conversation in the existing meetups and Agile groups that there are, rather than splintering the community. Ramesh's question actually is, are there any alliances or groups like we have Scrum and what I see around? Yeah, there's only the Agile 2 LinkedIn group. And we're hoping the Agile 2 ideas find their way into existing Agile groups.
Cliff, I think the question was, so you've got Scrum Org, you've got Agile Alliance, you've got all of these organizations who are trying to drive this forward, and he was wondering whether Agile 2 would have a similar organization, if I understood it correctly.
Okay, thanks, Mike. There is the group of 15 people who defined Agile 2. We intend to kind of oversee that content. We do plan to come up with a revision, hopefully not a big revision. It will still be called Agile 2, but it'll be like Agile 2 version 2 or something. But intending that it's still Agile 2 that's been fine-tuned a little bit. What we don't want to do is, we feel that the kind of territorial ownership of the Agile community by these different groups is a problem. People are going to monetize Agile. It's not inherently bad. People need to make money to live. Training, it takes a lot of effort to develop and provide training. That provides a lot of value if it's done well, if it's good training. So, we might provide training. The Agile 2 name has been trademarked to protect it from being used to being redefined. But the name is free to use by anyone, as long as they point to the website, and anyone can use the content as published under a Creative Commons attribution license. So anyone can create training for Agile 2. There's no ownership of the content. You can copy the content and publish a book containing the content, as long as you say this content comes from the agile2.net website. So there's no attempt to kind of own it in a restrictive sense, only to protect it. I don't know if that answered the question. Okay, well, thank you for the chance to present this today, Davis. I really appreciate it, and thanks everybody. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, I can be found in LinkedIn. The agile2.net website has an authors page where it lists each person and their LinkedIn URL. So any of us can be contacted. There's also the Agile 2 LinkedIn group. Feel free to reach out to me or any of the authors with ideas or concerns or questions or whatever. It's been a great pleasure, and I hope everybody has a good Friday evening.
Thank you, Cliff. Thanks
Thank you
for your wonderful session.
Thank you.